Hi again, everyone. I'm Angel Leviston. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications for the Metropolitan Planning Council. I want to say a huge thank you to everybody for joining us for our last event of 2020, which sounds absolutely crazy to say. The Metropolitan Planning Council is a nonprofit policy and planning organization that conducts research, advocacy, and technical assistance to support a better, bolder, more equitable future for the Chicago region. I just want to cover some housekeeping before we get started and before I introduce my colleagues. This event will be recorded and we will distribute a recording following this event in an email to all attendees. We will be taking questions for the panel. So should you have a question that pops up while we are having this discussion, please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask any questions you might want to propose to the group. We will promptly wrap up by 1 p.m. So perfect lunch hour program today. Now that the nuts and bolts are covered, I want to say I'm so thrilled to have such a great turnout for this event and what I know will be an interesting conversation. Like the rest of the world, our world at MPC has changed over the past 9 months, and I'm thrilled to be having this conversation with my colleagues where they will discuss the successes of the year and reflect on the impact that MPC had in changing perceptions and conversations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator today, MarySue Barrett, President of Metropolitan Planning Council.
Thank you very much, Angel. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm MarySue Barrett, and I've been so fortunate to be president of the Metropolitan Planning Council and to be asked to play the role of moderator with my colleagues. One of my favorite things to do is to be in conversation with innovators and change makers. Thank you, Angel, for the inspiration for today's conversation. Angel Leviston joined MPC as our Director of Marketing and Communications exactly at the time that work from home began. We can't imagine facing the unique challenges of 2020 without your calming, unifying presence, Angel. These past 9 months have felt like a roller coaster ride. As we approach year end, I've been reflecting on how MPC has changed and has changed me this year. I can recall that overwhelming sense of loss of community connections back in late March when I wrote a piece on the theme of "We will be there." From April into May, our lives were dominated by connecting with our partners to aid emergency response and to lay the policy and investment groundwork to build back better. And then came the devastation of the police murder of George Floyd and subsequent introspection about what more we could do individually and collectively to embed equity in all decisions. We asked ourselves, are we doing everything we must to build a better, bolder, more equitable future for everyone? Personally, my answer was no. And that has led me and the Metropolitan Planning Council to pause, to ask the tough questions, to interrogate our role in achieving radically different outcomes than what our 2017 cost of segregation study documented. The enormous challenges of 2020 caused us to stretch different muscles, sometimes stumble for sure, and as a result, grow individually and as an organization. That is ongoing work. We're so lucky that MPC is part of a robust ecosystem of change makers. Thanks to many of you for being our partners. We learn something every day, and we do so by sharing power, centering history, taking risks, challenging assumptions. This is what I call learning out loud, and I'm so glad to have a chance to do it with you today. We have learned a lot together. For today's event, we scoured our ambitious 2020 agenda and selected just 4 stories, ones we're excited to share with you, covering successes and failures. And I've gotten some super smart colleagues convened here with me to help bring these accomplishments and learnings to life. So to start us off, I'm going to introduce you a little bit more to the 4 people whose faces you've been looking at. We're going to first introduce you to Research Director Dan Cooper, who will illuminate how MPC leveraged a first-time research collaboration with Kids First Chicago. Kids First, as the next slide will show, quantifies how the digital divide was sidelining a huge number of at-home learners. The findings set the stage for a $50 million commitment from Mayor Lightfoot and Chicago Philanthropy to help more than 100,000 families. It's called Chicago Connected, along with Kids First Chicago. We were delighted to produce that report. I'm also going to introduce you in a moment to Manager of Health Equity and Planning, Chloe Gurin-Sands. Chloe will help describe how an independent organization like MPC works to forge trust with the public sector. As the City of Chicago lays the groundwork for We Will Chicago, which is the first citywide plan since the 1960s, yep, we are helping government leaders think bigger, consult more broadly, and commit more deeply to equity. I'll also be in conversation with Associate Debbie Liu. Debbie will transport us to a large city-owned lot at Howard and Ashland in Rogers Park. That's where MPC first experimented with a wide variety of virtual organizing tools and tactics. That made it possible to engage a broader range of local residents who then provided input to their alderwoman, Maria Haddon, about the community's dreams for this parcel. And finally, we'll be in conversation with Manager of Water Resources, Ryan Wilson. Ryan's going to help demystify a new tool called Storm Store that can help prevent really costly flooding that hits some neighborhoods during every storm. It's an innovative market mechanism. So we're learning how to educate government partners, landowners, and investors about innovation and about risk-reward trade-offs. You know, we're sharing these images that you just saw to underline something really important to MPC and our work. It's not just about policies and data, it's about the people that help us achieve our desired impact, and our effectiveness depends on our ability to paint a clear picture of exactly who is hurting and who will benefit from the help, and to invest the time in building trust with our diverse partners, many of you. I'm grateful to Dan and Chloe, to Debbie, to Ryan, to the four colleagues here who will help fill in the sketch that I just provided about some of our biggest learnings for 2020. So I'm going to start off some questions on a few themes. The first theme is this idea of new organizational alliances. You know, back in 2017, when MPC came out with our cost of segregation findings, which documented just a stunning shared cost of segregation, it changed us fundamentally as an organization and how we today try to embed equity in every single area of our work. And we believe that every organization, literally everyone, needs to do the same. So Dan, I'm going to start with you. And if you could help us understand with this idea of new organizational alliances, how are you leveraging new research partnerships that you lead, such as with Kids First Chicago, to change historic investment patterns that have caused this tremendous harm?
Thanks, MarySue. Happy to take that. I would say if there's one thing I've learned and I want to take with me from 2020 is that we are all more powerful, more impactful together. And so, you know, we have a tendency as researchers often to think we have the best ideas and we're studying very sticky issues, and there's a tendency to stay in your lane and do your own research and put it out. And often that leads to us just sort of yelling in a vacuum or putting out findings that make a flash in the pan but don't lead to impactful change. And I think 2020, I've seen a massive pivot, not only with MPC, but other organizations not wanting to just do something to do it, but really figure out how to be more impactful. And that's led to some great partnerships. And this one with Kids First started just with a cup of coffee with Daniel Anello and I, the executive director, before the pandemic hit, just to get to know each other. MPC hasn't typically done a ton in the education space. We're not the experts there, and Daniel and his organization is. And so, you know, building that relationship, getting to know each other, mutual respect for each other led to, when the pandemic hit, this opportunity to work together to double the impact. So Kids First had been leading this research on the digital divide. They had been talking to families, CPS families, and hearing very early on what a struggle it was for many CPS families with students. And you know, there isn't great data available on the precise number of households. We rely on the census, and those stories had been out there before. But Daniel thought we can get this out in a new and innovative and important way and really make an impact. And so we put our heads together. Kids First led the data collection effort. both mapping it out and having great quotes from families. And we put our heads together on how we could get this message out. And I think because it was more than just one organization behind it, it opened this issue up to a different audience. More media picked up on it. There's double the pressure on the city to figure it out. And that's exactly what happened. Through relentless pressure from Kids First and our communication, our joint communications effort, we have a great feel-good story, which was $50 million was raised to identify CPS students who needed a connected device in the home. And that was rolled out this summer and into the fall. So going into the new CPS school year, we saw more kids connected. And so whether it's this project or another, I've worked in concert with the Field Foundation and other researchers who want to just have a unified voice in making sure we approach things differently. We finally center equity in getting investments to the right places, the right communities. And we are more powerful together. It doesn't have to be MPC. It doesn't have to be one organization. When we partner together, great things can happen. And so I'm looking to do much more of that in the future.
I love that example. An organization that has so much respect within their sector, but wanted to tap into the work that you've been leading, Dan, on racial equity and understanding disparate impact. We really did find that we complemented each other. And if more cups of coffee could lead to multi-million-dollar investments, our region would be a lot better off. But sometimes that overture, that collegiality is where it starts. And so we're big believers in that. Ryan, I'd also like to hear a little bit from you on this theme of new organizational alliances. On the work that you lead on Storm Store, we have a very critical organizational partnership, and I'd like to learn a little bit from you about that.
Yeah, thanks, MarySue and Dan, for teeing up some of the themes there. So we have a partnership with the Nature Conservancy, and by the time the pandemic hit this year and we all moved into quarantine, our organizations, our partners in government and in community organizations, we had a really strong foundation. And I think it's fair to say that foundation was built long before I got to MPC, and it was built on a few things that both of our organizations are known for. First, I think the building strong relationships and developing trust across the decades of work that we've been doing. Over 140 years combined in Illinois is where our organizations have been working. But for the last 4 years, we've been working on a very focused effort to build partnerships on addressing stormwater and urban flooding in our region. And we've been able to do that because of our organizational alignment around stormwater issues. The Nature Conservancy is very focused on urban conservation, increasingly focused on urban conservation. They have deep experience in implementation, having helped to set up and operate or kind of work in the market, the stormwater trading market in Washington, D.C. And they have an incredibly deep bench of professionals who are experienced in innovative stormwater markets and environmental markets, who've worked nationally and internationally to establish similar types of programs and continue to replicate their efforts elsewhere. And that complements our work in being local conveners and being experts in research and policy change initiatives, and also having the experience on our team, and you see it on the screen, of cross-sector kind of insights and kind of intuitive ways of working with government, with business, and with community members. And that helped us to build this strong foundation, which goes on to make kind of the impact of what we're trying to achieve in the region. And I will say there's two other really effective things that have come out of this sort of partnership, which is, I think, fairly unique, is the kind of fluidity of funding and the support of our philanthropic partners who've helped to, through both organizations, drive change and innovation in the development of a local stormwater market. And then I think the second thing is, and this speaks really to this year, is the willingness of both organizations to evolve the partnership, dealing with the challenges of start, stop, and policy changes, taking on new roles to meet projects in a remote environment, and adapting to new styles of working.
It's a great example. And when I reflect on what Dan shared about this partnership that was intense but is something that we can return back to at the next opportunity, or the sustained partnership, Ryan, that you just described with the Nature Conservancy. They have all sorts of ripple effects on the work. And then something else, which Ryan, you just brought to life, which is we've got passionate volunteers, board members, and donors. And one of the things that we love about Chicago is our deep reservoir of talent on the civic side, but it can be a frustration because it can be confusing. Who does what? Who's got the lead on what? And so whenever we can join forces and build an alliance, our supporters and volunteers and board members, people who write checks, they are very happy because they know that it is a multiplier effect, quite literally, and that makes us all feel like we're being more effective. So thank you for bringing that to life. And Nature Conservancy has been an amazing partner. Looking forward to hearing a little bit more about that. There's another theme that I wanted to get into about building trust with local communities and with government. When I reflect on this, I think that sometimes there's almost a collision or a feeling of a collision, that being an ally to local community leaders and organizations, is it at odds with being a helper to the public sector? And Chloe, I think you're well positioned to help us untangle this. What have you learned as you've been working on citywide planning about, this fall we held a bunch of workshops. You've been working very methodically about building trust, both with community allies and with public sector allies. So what's some of the takeaways from that?
Thanks, MarySue. Through our work on the citywide planning process, we have been cultivating relationships both with the city and our partners there within the Department of Planning and Mayor's Office and other departments, as well as hosting what we call the Planning Coalition, which is a group of stakeholders. And sorry, everyone, you see and hear my son with me, but a group of multi-sectoral stakeholders that are coming together to also give recommendations on what a citywide planning process should look like. And for us, I think cultivating trust on both ends has really been about making sure that we're very clear with our message with both of those audiences all the time around that our goal is to bring equity and good planning into this process. We heard throughout our workshops where we actually were able to bring together city officials, both in Chicago and from other cities around the country, with community-based organizations and private sector and philanthropies, that people want the planning process to be a trust-building exercise. And so part of our work is not only building trust with us, with those entities, and helping, ensure that everyone knows that we're trying to get the outcome for all parties involved, but also directly helping those different parties engage with each other and build that trust with each other, not always having us mediate that relationship.
Mm-hmm. That makes so much sense. Sometimes you have to build the bridge, but then make sure it's strong for everyone. Paco? For the interruption there. You lose me? I hope I'm back. We're delighted to have Gael join us as a hopeful sign of why we are doing this citywide plan for our generation and for future generations. But your point about building trust takes some risk, takes some time, is something that I know, Dan, you've also been thinking about as you do research collaborations. And I know you've been involved with some intensive and complex ones recently, figuring out how to work across different sectors that maybe have different needs is not easy work. So help us understand how trust building has played out in your work.
Yeah, I think it's huge because, as I said earlier, there are a lot of us out there who have great ideas and want to get things done, but it's much harder to do it together in a way that goes quickly and is effective. So I think it just, it takes the you need the time to build the relationships so people can understand you and know where you're coming from and what your values are. And I think it takes great leadership as well to inspire people to move in the same direction. And I think, as a researcher, a lot of us have been making the same map of Chicago over and over and over again for years, right? Whether it's race, poverty, violence, commute times, the things we care about the dearest that are the biggest issues of inequity. A lot of us are tired of making those same maps. We want to see things change. So I think there's a hunger out there for people to see something more impactful with the research collaboration. But of course, we're all funded to do different things. So it takes a lot of work outside of work hours to make sure we're being accountable to each other and, getting to know each other and how to work with each other. So I think I've been fortunate enough to be a part of some work across foundations, across research institutions, across the private sector, all of like-minded folks who are similarly tired of seeing the same map and talking about the same issues. So I think capitalizing on that will and those values of doing everything we can to see some movement, and knowing how devastating the pandemic has been for Black and Brown communities in particular across Chicago. There's so much will to be capitalized on. It just takes the effort, the little bit of extra effort to build some relationships, get to know people, be accountable to each other, and working together in new ways, even though you're not funded to do it. Is crucial, and we're starting to see, I think, some positive movement. We have a long way to go in terms of getting our funds flowing in ways that help neighborhoods recover. But we worked with 20 or so foundations this summer to share data in new ways about where their investments were going pre-COVID and post-COVID, and we are seeing some encouraging signs of shifts. Prior to the pandemic, many of these foundations primarily funded downtown organizations or Northside organizations on a dollar per resident basis. And after the pandemic, that shifted completely. And more funds per resident were reaching Black and Brown communities on the south and west side of the city and the county. So it takes time, it takes a willingness to share data in new ways, and it takes encouragement. So, companies don't want to be punished if they release data and it doesn't show something positive. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to just keep the momentum going and to build over time like a snowball. And so that's something we've been seeing so far this year, and we hope to keep it up.
Just a quick follow-up, Dan, because I think this work relates to so many other institutions. First of all, you said something important, that MPC uses some of the funds we raise generally to build this capacity, so that when an opportunity is now and the response has to be quick, we can step up and say yes and help provide glue and expertise and alliances. So I'm proud of you for having done that along with colleagues. But can you say a little bit more about which institutions have been driving this, and then beyond philanthropy, do you see that this understanding, this illumination of dollars flowing one way and needing to flow differently in the future, how that can affect even more institutions like private sector?
Yep. Yeah, so Angelique Power, who runs the Field Foundation, I think was the lead person and visionary and organizer who reached out, tirelessly across the private sector, across the nonprofit sector, to really, see who had the will to try to push for greater data transparency and to get foundations, primarily initially, to commit to funding differently. And so, the Chicago Community Trust, MacArthur Foundation, Healthy Communities Foundation, A Better Chicago, just to name a few, all jumped up and said, yes, we want to be a part of this solution. And then a group of researchers as well from Chapin Hall, MPC, University of Illinois, Chicago, Institute for Race Research and Public Policy, also said, absolutely, we want to be a part of this. How can we help? And so I think, the philanthropic sector was the first one that we were able to successfully penetrate, because these are all colleagues saying yes, we'll all be a part of it. It's a little bit easier. And then the public sector jumped on board and said, we'll share whatever data we can about where the CARES Act funds went, where PPP funds went. And so the groups who work with those data came to the table very quickly and shared them. And then, the toughest nut to crack, of course, is the private sector. But we've been working with some folks in the corporate coalition to get corporations to sign up as well to help us understand where their commitments are, where they have been, where they're going in the future. And so, of course, that's the last frontier, because the private sector doesn't typically operate that way in terms of being very transparent about where investments are going. Part of that is because they could look bad if it shows that investments are going primarily downtown and not in Black and brown communities. But the constant relationship building, encouragement, and momentum, we're hoping more and more will be on board, so that we as a city, as institutions, are behaving differently with our funds, and we all know success when we see it.
Right. That's a critical insight and a great example of building trust. And then I think we have to remind ourselves that the capacity starting point is so variable across different communities. When we're not all working from home at MPC, our office is downtown, but the work that we're doing is so focused on helping communities which have been mistreated in the past, whether they be city or suburban or exurban communities. And so, we do have to look at the big picture of how this is evolving to fill in gaps and to build capacity so that communities can drive their own future. That's the big view. Thank you for that example of building trust. And I'm going to move to another important theme, which is how do you do community engagement in a virtual world? And Debbie, as a critical player on our community engagement team, you've got a lot to share with us here. I'm thinking back to March when MPC began laying the groundwork to pivot events like this and community engagement and technical assistance to virtual. As you worked, Debbie, in Rogers Park this year, how hard was that exactly? And what did you find worked and didn't work from our technical assistance partnership there? It's called the Corridor Development Initiative.
Sure, thank you. So the Corridor Development Initiative, the CDI, as we love to call it, is a series of interactive public workshops that consist of engaging the general public, but engaging small stakeholders as well. But really it was designed so that people have this understanding and proactive planning with the context of market realities. And so a lot of that is really confusing to a lot of people. And it's already confusing even in a non-virtual setting. And so when we decided that it makes the most sense to maximize engagement, but also to improve the health and safety of not just our volunteers, our staff, but also the communities at large, we really wanted to figure out how to be interactive and still engaging. So we did a series of videos in the beginning just to introduce people to some of the basic concepts of zoning, of planning, proactive planning, things like that. And then we launched these larger workshops that we did in Zoom, but we also live streamed it through Facebook Live on the Alderwoman's Facebook page for the 49th Ward Alderwoman Haddon. So that also highlighted more people who would have potentially attended in-person workshops, but also it helped expand some of the people that we were reaching. In addition, when we were actually trying to do a traditional block activity where people place blocks that represented like a retail shop or a place block that represented housing, people really love that activity when it's in person, but because
you're describing like building blocks, like wooden building blocks. Okay, yeah.
So, but we couldn't do that, and so we had to do some hybrid. So virtually, there were some like technical glitches that we need to work through. There's some technical programs that we needed to work through, but overall, we were able to really engage in a more creative way and reach a larger audience, and that's something that we haven't been able to do before. I think one of the big challenges that we have is to us is equity. If we are infusing equity and engagement, it's not just about how many people you reach, it's about the people and the types of people that would have traditionally not been included being reached. And that is something that we were really adamant about. And so we even like pivoted in other ways, doing intercept surveys through community groups. We also did some focus groups virtually, translated things into Spanish and Swahili. And so there's many different examples of how we pivoted this whole program, not just to move things virtually, but also move things so that it represented the people that lived in Rogers Park.
Those are great specific examples. And I know I loved the do-it-yourself kit for some people who weren't comfortable virtually and, you know, wanted to actually, you know, touch and feel some options for providing input. So you really experimented with a lot of different tools there. And as you said, very importantly, it's not about counting heads, how many dozens, how many hundreds of people participated in a particular engagement, but rather if traditionally you see more homeowners than renters participating, were we able, and I am proud that we saw some progress on this, to get people who didn't ever in the past participate, but now virtual can actually democratize that. I'm also curious, Debbie, with another part of work that you've contributed to our momentum this year. It's not all just neighborhood-based technical assistance. Sometimes we'll do training for different sectors, and diversity, equity, inclusion is something that probably almost everyone participating on today's event has done something as far as DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion training this year. We've done some of that ourselves. And how about that skill building? What have you learned about engagement in that kind of setting?
So in March, April, we were already planning some type of like DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion type of workshop, but then a series of things happened. COVID happened, and it really highlighted the root systemic issues that we weren't necessarily addressing. But as COVID was unfolding, we were seeing a lot of these issues pop up, and people were making quick decisions to do some stopgap measure for the sake of improving health, and just closing things or making things inaccessible for certain people. And then we took a step back, and then we were like, well, should we be thinking about how these decisions are actually impacting a larger ecosystem? And so over the summer, we had 5 workshops that were designed for the general public, that were designed for a very specific niche of urban planners, or designed for government folks. And so that really highlighted the need for diversity, equity, inclusion in the decision making as we are undergoing not just this trauma from COVID, but also the racial uprising and all the things that have happened this year that really are rooted in a lot of the systemic issues that we haven't been able to figure out and solve. And so as we are thinking about making like Build Back Better or changing policies in a more equitable way, we really need to think about how they're all linked together and there is intersection, and that equity has to be part of the decision making as well as justice. So it's not enough to really just highlight this is a better way to make a better decision, but how does this actually affect the people who have long been disinvested in, have long been at the back end of a lot of the decision making? And so as we were doing these virtual settings, we were also recognizing that the people who were accessing this had to have internet, had to have some type of work from home or some flexibility as we were doing these workshops during the day. And we're thinking about how to actually unfold this in the 2021 year in a more hybrid model where it's not just virtual, but paired with some in-person when it's safe modules, so that the people who are making decisions are actually able to make better, more informed decisions about how that decision is actually impacting the people who have always been negatively impacted.
Thanks for sharing those different kinds of examples of how virtual engagement has been a learning process for us, for all of us, as well as how it might evolve, as you were just hinting at, into 2021. I guess the only constant is change, that we know we need to continue to experiment and measure. One of the things that the Metropolitan Planning Council is very excited to apply some of what Debbie was just talking about is with a partnership we'll be involved with called Together We Rise. It's the Chicago Community Trust's emerging effort on how we co-create a blueprint for an equitable recovery and what investments and what policies we can all get behind. So a lot of what you talked about, Debbie, are learnings that we can put to work as we even broaden that, that coordination. We're really excited about Together We Rise. There's one more theme that I want to get to, and then we encourage you to use the Q&A function to begin to populate with your questions. We will have some time for that. But there's this challenge that we grappled with of innovation in relation to the public sector. We know that the public sector is operating under these intense, unprecedented fiscal pressures at every level, uncertainty and heightened scrutiny. And Ryan, I'm thinking that you're in a really good position to help us with this question. How can we be sensitive here at MPC on staff to the fact that the reality of our key allies in the public sector is a pressure cooker? It's real that innovation can be a hard thing to accommodate when you're operating in a crisis. So tell us about how we can help our public sector partners, and with your experience with StormStore, what kind of innovation and experimentation can we help them embrace?
Yeah, well, thanks, MarySue. I think that's a great question to ask of StormStore, this project we started to talk about a little bit earlier. But one of the things I think is really unique about MPC in our region is that we sit at this intersection of different types of institutions and community-based institutions as well. And part of our job in that role is to respect the work of these institutions. With StormStore, our first pilot project is enabled by the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. And this is a regional utility for those not from our area or who don't follow wastewater digest daily like I do. And they are a key institution. They've been around for over 100 years. They've been operating wastewater treatment plants for 90 years. They have the authority to manage our watershed for only 15 years. And they are an incredibly high capacity organization that has multiple different responsibilities. And we first have to understand that as an institution. They have incredible staff, they have elected officials, they have a massive operating budget fueled by property tax, and they have access to federal, state funding sources as well. So being a good listener is one of our kind of obligations and opportunities. And our work is rooted in the authority of these sorts of institutions, especially MWRD. And we build upon their expertise. We build upon the policies they already have in place. And StormStore, one of the reasons it's innovative is that it is a tool that builds upon existing permit processes, that builds upon existing authority that has been years in the making. And so what StormStore allows us to do, and if you'll forgive me, I'll just do a brief background. But StormStore essentially helps us manage wet or dry, in a wet or dry region, excess rain capacity. And this often results from increased urbanization and climate change. We're getting bigger storms, they're more damaging. And in our region, and in many regions, they've created an inequitable impact in communities that have not been able to, or have not seen public investment, and do not have the operating revenues to maintain their existing infrastructure. So it's a huge equity issue that has resulted from a variety of reasons that affected cities and MPC works on. But our role is to listen, to observe, to identify where these problems are occurring. And with StormStore, what we identified is that there is an opportunity to use the existing permit process, the existing regulatory process, to leverage the interests of developers who want to build projects for low cost in a time efficient manner, and help to transfer some of the potential impacts, potential benefits of those investments in one part of a watershed to a other part of the watershed that has lower capacity, that has seen less private development. And so essentially storm stores taking advantage of that private market interest to see a public benefit. Some of the things that we've, and there's much more detail about how this process works, and we're in a startup phase, but the essence of it is that we have to identify innovative, at least for our region, and I do think storm store is innovative also for at a national scale, but in our region, it's innovative because it is looking at utilizing these private investments. It is attempting to, and we are attempting to put in place or see put in place small and strategic public investments that leverage outsized private investments. So seeding the development of voluntary stormwater capacity is something that would be novel in our region and could have outsized impacts on both the district's MWRD's ability to manage, but also the benefits and the community benefits that are being driven back to communities where there is lower investment capacity. And that's one example of the sort of innovations that we think have to happen to leverage these sort of outsized ways to address urbanization and climate change in our region.
And I appreciate you bringing to life the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District as an example, because these are not always governments that are well known or well understood, and yet understanding their reality, as you really crystallized for us, is the key to unlocking innovation. And how do you create that win-win, right? That's part of the goal. We're starting to get some questions, so I'm eager to get to those, but wanted to have a quick follow-up with you, Chloe, because this idea of innovation and working with the public sector certainly plays out in the work that you've been doing on citywide planning. So some reflections from you on that same question.
We knew, but our peer workshop certainly underscored that being able to put together a citywide plan that has the level of deep stakeholder and community engagement that we would want and really has the teeth to be implementable, it's really expensive. It takes a lot of resources. And so, our counterparts at the city responsibly are trying to work within the resources that they know that they'll have. And I think there's a push-pull there where we are simultaneously encouraging them to, think about what is the planning process that we would want to have if we had all of the resources that we need. And, can we try to sketch that out and go after some more resources to try to beef that up instead of starting from a place of, not necessarily expecting to have the resources that we would want. So I think, it's balancing that responsibility, but also still trying to show, if we had more, this is what we would like to do, and trying to court some more resources into our corner.
Yeah, it's having both big ideas. And I know that was inspired in part by the work that you and your colleague Christina Harris did of bringing in experts from 7 different cities that have approached their citywide plans in very unique ways with different price tags, right? Different staff support, and knowing that we have to kind of work within a resource constrained environment, but also say, hey, if we had gone into a pandemic and all the other crises we faced with a citywide plan, think of all of the roadmaps and strategies that would have already been brokered. So we know the price of being unprepared, and it's worth investing in. So that's part of this duality of moving along with modest resources, but also preparing to go for it and to think bigger, because that's the spirit of Chicago, and that's certainly the kind of vision of better, bolder, more equitable that drives our work. So I see a question, and I want to encourage others to use the Q&A chat. But there's a really good question that came in first about environmental justice and sustainability. So when there are big efforts led by philanthropy like Together We Rise, or led by the city of Chicago, this very key effort called Invest Southwest, focused on 10 Chicago neighborhoods. How do we make sure that those are grounded in economic outcomes, which they are, but that those are not exclusively just viewed from an economic lens? How do we bring that environmental justice and sustainability lens? And maybe Chloe, you could also grab that one.
Sure, this is something that we see also a lot in our riverfront planning work, where oftentimes economic development and environmental justice are pitted against each other. And more and more, we've been hearing and working from folks in, the environmental justice networks in Chicago and, the other networks that we touch on, that's really a false dichotomy, that we really need to get more innovative in the city about what it looks like to start planning for a future of innovative industries that use the riverfronts, that are able to not only coexist on these riverfront sites, but also improve the waterways as part of what their businesses are. And so I think really breaking that one or the other and starting to think more creatively. And I think, things like Storm Store are also great examples of that.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else want to weigh in on this environmental justice or sustainability question? Otherwise, I can go to another question. I see one that is addressing the issue of small business, and I'm going to expand it a little bit. So MPC does a lot of work on affordable housing solutions. Some of our experts are not on this panel today. We'll do another forum, certainly with those colleagues, as we have done a lot of housing related issues in the past. But the point is to understand each of the contributors to our economy from a small business perspective. So small landlords are small businesses, right? Those who are affected by the decimation of the hospitality and restaurant sector are many, many small businesses. And so when we think about measuring community health, we have to look at the individual and the family, and we also have to look at the small business ecosystem because it's been really hard hit. And I know, Dan, that you did some work really early on in this crisis about the impact on small businesses. So I'm wondering if you have some insights about how, as we look to a recovery and the kind of resources and structures that we need, how can we make sure that we're simultaneously supporting renters and landlords? How can we make sure that we're attentive to building the supplier networks as well, where neighborhood-based entrepreneurs can grow and can get bigger?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer, and it's a tough one, is a lot of support is necessary to make sure folks aren't slipping through the cracks. Renters are protected up until the end of this year. We expect or hope that will be extended, but I think there obviously is a risk for landlords, right? And so that we need federal funding, we need state funding, we need all hands on deck, and we're going to do everything we can to continue to push narratives about why this is important, using research to make the case. So there isn't an easy answer. The answer is much more advocacy, using data to tell stories, to make sure that we tell the story of small businesses, that we tell the story of landlords and of renters. So I think it's all hands on deck, and this is going to be a story for a year or two to come, at least. So I don't have the answers other than we're going to keep pushing.
Right. We can add our voice. And Debbie, I think I think you want to jump in on this one too.
Yeah, I think something that we've been thinking about a couple of years ago was the Preserving Affordability Together, and how we piloted that in East Garfield Park 2 years ago. And we're looking to see how this is gonna impact a lot of the communities in Chicago. And it's not just on a housing perspective, but also on the small businesses side. So if there are no small businesses that residents are actually going to, then where are they going to get their groceries? Where are they going to get their ethnic food? Or where are they going to get some of the basics that really bring a community together? And that's something that we are thinking about, researching, talking to communities, because they're already being faced. A lot of restaurants had to close temporarily. Some of them are permanently closed. And what does that mean for land and land use moving into the future as we recover from COVID? I think those are all valid questions that we are internally asking as well.
That's a great addition, Debbie. And you're right, our work in East Garfield Park, again, always with community partners, is help bringing together what is often siloed. You know, the affordable housing people sometimes talk within their community, and economic development folks may be a separate cohort of people. And that's one of the values that MPC hopes to bring to all of our conversations, whether they be in one neighborhood like East Garfield Park, which is experiencing some inflow of investment. Our research partners at DePaul University helped us see that housing values were really starting to jump up in East Garfield Park. So we have to be proactive. And then, of course, a pandemic and other crises, you know, kind of hits us in the gut and makes us think differently. One other example I can bring in about the ecosystem and continuum is we're doing a lot of work as part of our water program on lead service lines, of making sure that our lead pipes are something that we methodically commit to replacing to protect the health and to build the economy of our region and neighborhoods. And when you think about that, it could be viewed as a big challenge, like big price tag, how are we going to fund this? Or it could be viewed as an opportunity where we can create apprenticeships, which lead to small business contractor creations, which then can grow into bigger companies working in a revolving system, which is building talent, building ownership, building wealth, building our green economy. And so that's the kind of attentiveness to small business and silo busting that we try to bring really to all of our work. Ryan, were you wanting to jump in? Okay. I'm going to, as we begin to wind down, ask our panelists to reflect on a big question, which is with all of these successes and stumbles, learnings, things we're really proud of pivoting on, but always quick to acknowledge that nothing that you've heard about today is something that we do alone, and recognizing that the lessons from 2020 are going to continue to evolve and challenge us to evolve and change. That is, if we want to achieve transformative change. So thinking ahead to 2021, I'd like to ask each of you to share a closing thought briefly about something you're optimistic about, energized by. And Debbie, could I start with you on that one?
Sure. Yeah, I think that we have way more tools that we can all utilize now, whether people are using Zoom or some virtual format, or going back to in-person small groups or large groups. There are more tools that people have started to innovate with, whether that's mural boards or just like different tools that people have started. And I'm really interested to see how that's going to all play out when we all eventually try to meet in person, because I feel like the what's going to happen is actually we're going to try to do hybrid models so that people who want to engage virtually can still engage, and then there's still options to engage tactilely and in person, just the same that we had before.
I'll sign up for that hopeful prediction. Ryan, can I ask you to go next?
Yeah, I'm really optimistic about the progress that's been made over the years at our public institutions to embrace increased data transparency, increased use of data and technology in solving some of these really wicked problems, things like climate change or more locally urban flooding. And I believe that the progress that we'll see in 2021 is more partnership across these agencies. And what I think it'll lead to is public institutions making more strategic investments that leverage investment in by the private market for self-interest reasons, most likely, but also for community benefit.
That's an exciting vision of where we can get to. Chloe, how about some of your thoughts about how we can turn 2021 into an opportunity?
Yeah, I think building both on what Debbie and Ryan said, you know, I think the opportunity will still exist for us to focus on what a lot of these systemic issues were that we've really seen bubbling to the top during 2020. So as we hopefully continue to move forward with vaccine rollout and things improve as far as the pandemic. I want us to continue to use 2021 as an opportunity to dive into those systemic issues like climate change, structural discrimination, and not lose sight of setting us up for a better future. And, you know, like you said earlier, MarySue, if we don't address those, we're going to see the same problems reoccurring and getting worse. And so let's just not forget to continue working on that.
Thank you, Chloe. And Dan, how about some thoughts looking to the new year from you?
Yeah, for me, and I'll try to answer one of the questions in the chat while also talking about my hopes. One is that we are slowly getting better at using data and metrics to evaluate the impact of investments. And that's one of the things we're working with the Trust, with their Together We Rise Fund, to help them evaluate the impacts. The comment in the chat was about whether or not there is a metric for economic development versus environmental justice. And I think the answer is not yet, but that's something we hope to develop. So there aren't trade-offs we're making with economic development funds. And I think making progress on disinvested neighborhoods is not something that's going to happen overnight, but I'm confident that the ship is slowly turning, and we can work together to use data in better ways to know the effectiveness of projects like Together We Rise.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, I know that metrics, especially shared regional metrics, are really critical for creating alignment and fostering that kind of innovative partnerships. A lot of the themes that we've touched on today are made easier if we're clear about what the blueprint is for change. And every organization doesn't have to do it together, but can do it in concert so that we do see this multiplier effect. And that's a big part of my hope, is that we continue to take these values that are a lot easier to say than do, but interrogating power dynamics, bringing new voices into decision making. These are responsibilities and opportunities that MPC has. We are very fortunate to have built trust and relationships across many communities, many issues. We've got expertise on infrastructure. We've got expertise on tax policy. We've got relationships all throughout our mega metropolitan region and with other cities and regions that are innovators. So when I mentioned this idea earlier of learning out loud, it's really something we're trying to practice here with you today. Thank you for joining us, but also as we go forward. We know that there's much to be learned from other regions, but also Chicago is a laboratory for innovation. We're very excited to share what we're learning and push ourselves to be not last on lists, but an innovator. And that's our pledge to you, to continue to invite you to be part of conversations like this, partnerships, and we are very open to your ideas. So best holiday wishes to you. MPC stands for Metropolitan Planning Council and also for making positive change. So we hope that you will continue to partner with us in doing that into 2021. Thank you again to all of our panelists, my colleagues, Dan and Debbie, Chloe and Ryan. You are just a delight to work with, and everyone else from MPC staff and board. Thank you and wish you the happiest of holidays. Please stay safe and masked. Take care.